Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am absolutely delighted to be sitting here today with Simon Harrison, who has not only recovered from ME, but also written a book about it, which I'm actually holding here in my hand. It's a really great book called Leaving ME Behind, which I would highly recommend. And I think we're going to get into a lot of what you've written about and what you experienced through that kind of journey. So, Simon, I'm so delighted to have you here today. Thank you so much for doing it.
Hi, Jackie. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Perhaps you would just say sort of a brief overview of sort of who you are and maybe what led you to write the book.
So, what led me to write the book? Well, I kept a journal. I was 6 months in thereabouts to the illness of what I would later know was ME, and I just had this nagging feeling that I should be writing about this. I don't really know where that came from, but I didn't have an awful lot else to do anyway, so it made perfect sense to journal what I was going through. I didn't really have any grand designs at that stage of creating a book from it, but as I got better and better, and I was in various therapies, my psychologist and also my GP, just coincidentally, they didn't know each other, but they both said, "Have you thought about writing about this?" And I thought, well, I've been keeping a journal, so maybe that's what I should do. So here we are, the book is done and I managed to finish it.
Absolutely. And it's funny, isn't it, sometimes when it's like the buses thing, no buses for ages and then three buses come at once. And you're saying that actually two different people said to you, quite close together, did you think about writing a book? And it sort of makes you think, doesn't it, when you sort of see it twice kind of thing. And you started off by saying, what you would sort of later find out was ME. At the start, I mean, you don't really know what it is, do you? You sort of become ill and everything just feels overwhelming and chaotic and terrifying. Certainly was my experience. It was a very, very scary thing. And there was an amazing phrase that you had, I think it's very early on in the book, talking about a sea of denial in a sinking ship of optimism, which is just an absolutely beautiful phrase that I think perfectly kind of encapsulates that early stages of everything's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. Give myself a few more days. It's all going to be okay. And then that sort of steadily sinks. And, certainly I had an awful lot of denial before I kind of was able to settle into that kind of, okay, there's something going on here that maybe I need to pay attention to rather than try to steamroller over. So I don't know if you're able to just say a little bit about that kind of stage of how it all began.
I was 34. This was 2013, and I was very fit, very active, and healthy too. I'd never been seriously ill. I'd never broken a bone. I'd never been hospitalized, which is a slight minor miracle in itself, given the sorts of hobbies I had at the time. I was mountain biking, I was road cycling, I was snowboarding, I was surfing. I was doing all of this on a regular basis. And holidays for me were never to lie on a beach. It was always to take my bike, to go cycling up mountains, racing down mountains, all of this sort of thing. So I was very, very active. And so really the denial was that I thought, well, this just can't be happening to me. This is just not going to happen. This is not what I had in mind for life at all. So I was really in a lot of denial, and I had, going back to when it started for me, I had what I would describe as a seizure. That was never confirmed, but that's how it felt, where my brain just felt as if it was on fire. And I thought, well, this is either how it feels to go mad, or maybe I'm having some kind of breakdown or something. I really had no idea what was happening. I didn't feel like I was under any particular stress. I was running a business, but that had been established for a number of years. And I was working hard, but I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed what I was doing at the time. And so I didn't really know what had hit me on that day. And once it passed, everything changed in that moment. It's like my senses were cranked up to the maximum. I developed chemical sensitivities. I was sensitive to light, to sound, to vibration. The fatigue really began to kick in quite early on too, as did the brain fog. And just as time went on, I was collecting more and more symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so many people listening will be able to relate to so much of what you've said there. When you said I wouldn't sit on a beach for a holiday, I'm just like, yep, you're my people. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it's just again not the sort of thing that I would felt myself drawn to. And you're too fit to get sick, you're too young to get sick, all of these things that other people possibly said to you and you would maybe be saying to yourself as well, that kind of play into that kind of sense of denial. This can't be happening to me, this isn't in the plan, this was not how life was supposed to go, kind of thing. But ultimately may be entirely true that that wasn't how you planned your life to go, but also completely unhelpful because it's clearly how life is going right now in this moment for sure. Um, and how did you kind of find some level of, I don't know if you want to use the word acceptance or something kind of similar to that sort of, I mean, for me, it was acceptance of the moment rather than acceptance forever. So that kind of balance of acceptance and hope, maybe. How did that look like for you? And was it something you found really hard? Because I found it really hard.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I found it so hard that real true acceptance didn't come for quite some years down the road. I fought it for a long time. I fought it really to the point that I believed that I was simply burnt out,
Mm.
and I just worked on that basis. I thought I'm burnt out, and that's all it is. That's all this is. And I took comfort in that. And of course, it was a self-diagnosis, which was completely wrong, as it turned out. And so, on believing that's what I was going through, I started to make lots of lifestyle changes. So I started yoga, I started Tai Chi, I had Reiki, I had acupuncture, I started doing a lot of breath work, which I know that you're into, and I found that really helpful. And so it really came from the fact that I've always been quite mechanically minded, and I was restoring classic cars at the time, and so I really treated my body like a restoration project. And so I thought, well, you have to just take apart everything, and there's no point just restoring one end of the car. You have to just go right through that whole thing, top to bottom. And so I think that's where psychological therapies came in as well. And it's important for me to stress that I don't think for a moment that this is a psychological condition. But you have to bear in mind that at that stage of the illness, I hadn't sought out diagnosis. And so I was really doing the work on myself and on the computer researching, which again, I don't entirely recommend. I think it's really best to see a medical professional. But at the time, I mean, we're talking over a decade ago, I was extremely self-reliant. So asking for help, reaching out for help, I found very difficult. Thankfully, I'm different now. I'm able to. But I'd always prided myself on learning everything my way, doing everything my way, being a perfectionist, absorbing as much information as possible, and working out how to fix things, whether that's motorbikes, cars, bicycles, houses, whatever I was into at the time. So I thought, well, my body's no different. I'll just find out what's going on for myself and I'll fix myself up. So I scaled everything back. I was doing all the things that I've just mentioned. And my symptoms began to retreat slightly. I wasn't well at all, but I was able to function on a much lower level. So my window of tolerance had really shrunk. And going back to the denial, I was in a huge amount of denial that this was going to be any sort of long-term health condition. I thought perhaps a couple of months I'll be fine. I mean, even a few weeks after having the panic attacks and waking up during the night, sweating and having all sorts of peculiar symptoms, I still went on a holiday to the south of France with my road bike. It's crazy. And I thought, well, I'll go cycling. I'll just carry on like nothing's wrong, you know. So I did, and I was on that bike ride, and I couldn't do it. I was broken. I couldn't cycle as far as I intended to. I told my wife that I'd be gone for an hour or two, and I was back in 25 minutes, and I couldn't do anything more.
It's impossible, I think, for anyone who hasn't had this experience to understand what that feels like when the body literally hits a wall and shuts you down. It's not that you just need to buck up and stop being so lazy and pull yourself together.
Mm.
It's that literally, it's like someone's pulled the plug out of you. And I think, I mean, I've been recovered now for about 2.5 years at the moment, and it's getting harder and harder to remember quite how devastating that is when that happened, that it literally shuts you down and you can't. It doesn't matter where you are, if you're in the middle of Tesco's, if you're out for a walk, if you're sitting on the kitchen floor, it doesn't matter, wherever you are, the power's gone. And I mean, it's obviously physically extremely distressing, but I think you touched a lot on the kind of psychological side of it as well, which I think is important because it is mentally such a difficult journey to go on. It sounds like your sort of lifestyle before you became unwell was kind of quite similar to mine, and the kind of, you're always on, you're out and about, you're exercising, you're living life to the full, right? And then suddenly, almost overnight,
Mm.
everything gets ripped out from under you. Your entire being changes. And there is nothing in your life that doesn't affect. Your work, your ability to exercise, your ability to socialize, your financial situation, your relationship with others, your family, like everything is affected. And it's so difficult, isn't it? I think to come to terms with something like that and the sort of emotional side of that, I think can be just as hard as the physical side on some level to actually deal with. Because, I don't know, you can't see emotions. Some of the physical symptoms you can't see either, which is why it's challenging. But, the emotions are so inside of you that people don't really get, I think, what it feels like when your identity is just blown up. We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us.
That's right. It's so true. And I remember a moment where I was standing on a chair. This was just a couple of months into it. And I was changing the light bulbs in the lounge because they were too bright. And my wife said to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "It's just too bright." And, and then I realized, what am I doing? You know, what is this illness that is causing me to start changing light bulbs? But it's like you say, unless you've been there, it's very hard to explain. And these symptoms crept up on me very, very gradually, and they all came with a huge amount of fear because I would be thinking, "Goodness, what's going on now?" And the denial came from, on some occasions, a place of optimism, in that I was noticing that some days I was fine. Some days I would wake up and I would feel absolutely fine. And I think, oh, okay, so that's gone. I'm well, let's crack on. Let's get back to how things were. I hadn't come across the boom and bust cycle, the phrase, along with many other phrases that I would learn intimately over the coming years. And so I didn't really have a bigger picture. I didn't have a bird's eye view really of what was going on. To me, it was as if my sympathetic nervous system had been switched on and I couldn't switch it off. And so that hence getting into meditation and all of the other things I've mentioned, because I found that that would help to relieve those symptoms, that aspect, that feeling of being in fight or flight permanently and not being able to do anything about that. So I would listen to mindfulness meditations, and I didn't know anything about mindfulness at this point. And I would just listen to the guided body scans a few times a day, quite often. And I would just become much more aware of my body. And that really stood me in very good stead for when I would begin the slow process of recovery, because I lived entirely in my head until that point. To me, my body was just sort of a slave to what my mind came up with and what I wanted to do next. And so by getting to know my body much better and more intimately, I was able to really make some progress once I was put on the right track by my GP.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point as well. I mean, I very much can relate, and I see this day in, day out with people that I work with as well, is that sort of disconnection from our bodies. And, I think when we become unwell and everything in our bodies feels so uncomfortable, that widens the divide. We don't want to be connected to that because it doesn't feel good. So we actually often, I think, disconnect further, which is very natural reaction, but not helpful. But I think certainly for me, I was never really that connected to my body in the first place. And, slave to my mind, absolutely. My mind had this way of overriding my body, and I'd been doing it for years. And realizing that, I think, was a really key part of starting to understand my body and actually listen to it, which was then key to my recovery. And it sounds like you had quite a similar experience where that sort of learning to reconnect with your body, or to connect for the first time, possibly, was
Mm.
actually something. I think it's something that is actually really helpful and that allows us to live, I think, a more fulfilling and happier life. But that's when you're unwell, that's kind of like pie in the sky. I just want to feel better right now. But I think it helps. I think for both. Certainly, that was my experience.
Absolutely. And that's where I found meditation was so useful.
Mm,
I'd never had the slightest interest in meditation until that point. And when I began to try it, I had some extremely positive
mm,
experiences right at the beginning. And I was lucky to have done so, because it meant, to me, it was a place I could always go back to. I
certainly.
knew it was always there. I could do, if everything was becoming too overwhelming, if there were too many demands, if I was being overstimulated and my symptoms were reoccurring, then I would just take myself off and sit and breathe and meditate and just bring myself back down. And through doing this over so many years, as I would gradually recover, the, the sense of an intuitive sense of knowing what to do next began to occur. And my my inner guidance, if you like, began to come from a place of wisdom, in that I knew my body better and I knew what I needed to do. And sure, I still needed to have this almost athlete mindset, in that I would have to question my exhaustion. And again, this was many years down the road, once I'd been put on graded exercise therapy, but I was able to recognize what's stopping me. Am I afraid of a setback? Am I afraid of doing too much? And other days when I was doing too much, I was able just to notice it a lot sooner. I mean, it was definitely not a very smooth trajectory all the way through. I had lots of setbacks, hundreds of setbacks, big ones, small ones, you name it. But by knowing my body better, I was able to take action when I needed to, and just to rein it back in a little bit, or to boost it up. I mean, I remember about 5 years in, I was walking around the block where I live, and it's something that I had to do 3 or 4 times a day as part of my recovery, and having this thought that actually I might be able to jog, which was really something. And I thought, okay, that's really nice that I can even imagine what jogging might feel like, or that I can even contemplate doing it. Let's do it next time. And so I did, and it would be just a few steps, literally 3 or 4 seconds of jogging and then back to walking. But that's how gradual this can be for people.
Yeah, I love that. And the idea of sometimes, I think certainly to start with, I think, the way I see my sort of recovery trajectory was the kind of like down, 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 down in terms of, doing less, doing less, doing less, doing less, doing less. Still need to do less. Okay, do more less. And it was, that was the sort of denial phase for me. And then there was that kind of phase of building strategies, starting to find the things that worked, starting to learn a bit about my body and what was going on. And then the other bit of that was then the sort of upwards trajectory of, gradually reintroducing things. And, none of those phases were smooth, as you as you so beautifully put, they're lumpy, bumpy all over the place. But I think certainly at the start, it generally is less, 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 less. Because we're still in that mindset of we're fine, we're not going to be sick for very long. This isn't going to be a big problem. We're still in a kind of, quote unquote normal person mindset. Um, but then when we come out the other side, it's the other way around. I think, we're kind of we've learned how to be this person in this kind of new body where it's not able to do all the things that we used to be able to do. And it's actually kind of the other way around, isn't it? Of kind of, can I, but safely as well. And it's like, how do you do that in a way that, doesn't crash and burn? And I think it sounds like the answer for you was similar to me, is that you don't do it without crashing and burning. You just try and minimize the damage. We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we would be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
Oh, well, absolutely. Damage limitation. Yeah, it came down to that an awful lot. And one of my biggest setbacks came in 2.5 years after the initial symptoms occurred. And life was much smaller. Again, I was working within this window of tolerance that I'd established. And I suppose by that point I had given into it in some sense, that I had shrunk my world, but it was a necessary step. And I was also doing all of these things to look after myself as well. And so I was able to just muddle along. And sometimes I got overwhelmed, and I really had to take a back seat on lots of social occasions throughout those 2.5 years. But it was this one particular day that I went for a walk, and I had another sort of explosion of symptoms. And that was the point where I did finally seek professional help, which I should have done much sooner. But I thought I was managing it. I really did. And when I did go to the GP, I was relieved for two reasons. I was relieved, firstly, that I'd been doing all of the right things to help myself already. So that I was really grateful for that. There was just a lot of research and being open-minded. And like I said, through talking therapies, being able to work through the fact that I wasn't able to accept help and being more open to that. So when I got to the GP, having the diagnosis of ME/CFS was also, it was a relief in the sense that I had a name for this thing that I'd been suffering for the preceding 2.5 years. But I knew it came with the fact that this was an illness with no medicinal cure, and that was very difficult to deal with. I remember getting home and just falling on the bed with this leaflet in my hand that she'd given me, thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? Because I really thought that I was managing, and the setback and the diagnosis soon after, I knew that things could get more difficult, and they did. And that actually signaled the hardest part, the lowest point. So we're 2015, 2016 at this point, and things were very challenging. I suppose I spent about a year in bed and about 2 years on the sofa, on and off. I mean, I wasn't bed bound, but to spend that additional time more than most healthy people over the preceding years. So yeah.
I mean, I when I became unwell with long COVID, I mean, I was definitely in that kind of denial phase for a long time. And I remember, I can't remember who it was, but there was someone that sort of mentioned, oh, it might be a bit like ME. And, as soon as I heard that, I was just like, oh no, oh no, 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 no. Because, I'd known a couple of people who had had ME or CFS. And I didn't know them well. And in hindsight, I didn't understand their illness at all. But they had been ill for as long as I'd known them. So, that absolutely not, so there was total denial there. And I think there's something about a diagnosis that can give us that kind of sense of belonging, and you can find your tribe and that sort of connection and people who get you. And I think it can be helpful in some level, but then also, you do a Google search and suddenly the bottom falls out of your world, and you know, it can feel utterly, utterly hopeless. And it sounds like you maybe had kind of both of those sides of that experience when you got that diagnosis.
Oh, I absolutely did. And it's quite funny what you just said, because I remember having a similar experience. I'm certain I found it whilst Googling this stuff. And just like you, I read that the prognosis wasn't necessarily good. And I thought, well, no, that's not what I have. I mean, I was in no medical position to make that decision, but I decided on that level that that was not my illness. No, that's it. I'm just burnt out. That's me. That'll do. I'll take that. I can handle that. But no, it was far, far more distressing than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I would love to talk about your trip because,
Mm.
I mean, I'm getting that we are quite similar in quite a lot of ways. And what on earth possessed you to decide to drive across Europe?
Yeah, good question. It does sound like not the most sensible thing to do with a chronic illness.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
absolute magic, but yeah, what kind of set that in motion, and how on earth did you make it work?
Well, what it was one of my early appointments with my GP, who was just wonderful, by the way. She really was. She was an expert in fatigue-related illness. She took one look at me that first day, and I proudly read off to her all the things I've been doing to help myself, by which point I was so exhausted I could barely listen to what she had to say in response. But she said, yeah, this is a classic case of ME/CFS. And then she said, look, what would be really useful is to do the graded exercise therapy. There's something which I found useful, as I say, but I recognize that that's not recommended. The recommendations have changed around prescribing that. She said the other thing is, what would be really useful, I think, would be to do your recovery somewhere else, somewhere where it's brighter. She said, I think more light would help. And I thought, more light? I don't like light anymore. I mean, I love the sun, but I'm finding I'm the guy changing light bulbs. My quiet, dark room, lying on the floor for 4 or 5 hours a day, that's really where I am right now. And I thought that, I can't imagine I was in my bubble, my recovery bubble. Well, it wasn't even a recovery bubble at that point. It was just a bubble of suffering, really. And when she said that, I thought, no, there's no way. I can't imagine that. I'll just go and sit in the garden sometimes. That'll help. So I put it to the back of my mind, and I took everything else she was offering, and I followed it to the letter. And about a year in, a year after my initial consultation, I was making improvements. I still had a long way to go. I knew that, but I was making improvements. And I began to think about what she said, and I began churning over ideas and thinking, okay, I've done everything else I can do to help myself. I'd been seeing a dietitian also for a couple of years. I was eating all sorts of things that I would never have eaten before. I was taking all sorts of supplements. I was doing all sorts of tests, doing all of these things that so many of the listeners will relate to. I thought, okay, that's one thing I haven't tried. Why don't I try that? Maybe, who am I to argue? Maybe she's right. Maybe it will help. So I was doing my daily walk around the block, and it was pouring with rain. It was in the middle of winter. I was still in the middle of the pacing, and so I was dragging myself out in all weathers to keep walking, to keep my routine. And I got back, and I said to my wife, look, I think we should do this. And I said, I will be ready in 1 year. I don't really know where these words came from. It was quite funny. It just spilled out of me that evening. I didn't really have any plan at that point, but I knew I needed something to work towards. And I knew above everything else that I wanted to, and I just had to get better. And so that was it. She said, okay, we can make it work. And I think perhaps she thought that I was joking, or that I'd forget about it the following day, but I didn't, and that stuck in my mind. And whenever I had sufficient energy, disposable energy, I would dedicate it to that project, which was to take a year off, a year away in the sun. And so I found a house sitting website, and I thought that would be the most cost-effective way of doing it, would be to do some house sitting. And so I won't give too many spoilers for the book, but we ended up in Portugal, and we had a wonderful year.
I mean, it does sound kind of almost impossible, doesn't it? Like to be like, yeah, let's just do it. And you made it happen, and it worked. And you definitely pay tribute to your wife in the book, and it sounds like she was a incredible support to you throughout your experience, but also at a cost to her as well, which again I can relate to, because my partner was wonderful, but it wasn't that it didn't have an effect on him, the fact that I was unwell. And I love that. I mean, it sounds like you said, we're going to go to Europe for a year. And she said, okay. Like, was it as easy as that?
Well, I think, like you say, she was hugely understanding, and the illness had obviously had a ripple effect on her and on my daughter, on our daughter. And so she knew how hard I was really trying to get better. And she also knew that if it was going to help, I mean, of course, none of us knew that, but if it was worth a try, she was going to support me through it, and we were going to do it. And luckily, she agreed that it was a half sensible idea at that stage.
Half sensible, excellent. Um, and I mean, you said just then how hard you were trying to get better. And I noticed this in myself. And again, I see it in people day to day that actually sometimes we fall into that trap of trying too hard. And that our body, rather than seeing all of the good things that we're doing as good things, it just sees it as yet another to-do list, which is terrifying. And I'm wondering, I mean, I had an experience where, I had a week's holiday. We just went somewhere wet in Scotland because most places are wet when you decide to go on holiday. And just having a week where I was away somewhere different and I did feel better. I didn't feel 100%, but I did feel better. And I think it was because I was somewhere else. I was able to, let go of the sort of really strict kind of you do this and then that, and all of the good stuff. And I'm wondering if you had a similar experience that, having done a lot of work, put a lot of that foundation in, things had stabilized a bit, that actually then being able to let go and just go and drive and be somewhere new and be on an adventure allowed you to kind of, I don't know, be that sort of adventurer, and tap into some of that joy. But you had that baseline of all of the practices that you'd been doing, and I don't know if it was almost like freeing to get away and be on that adventure.
Yeah, it was hugely freeing, and I found very soon after getting on the road that the contents of my mind changed.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a huge shift. And as much as I needed to be home during those very difficult years, almost instinctively, to be somewhere familiar and nurturing and healing and be surrounded by people who care and want to help was definitely important. But I also needed to, I felt, break out of my routine to get some perspective on the illness, because it still remained in many ways and I was still having setbacks. I remember packing the car the day we left and having to have a sleep at my mum's house. We were staying at my mum's, we rented our house out, and obviously sleep, like many other things, was hugely disrupted, and I managed to stop sleeping during the day at that point, but I really had to just give in and I had to just have a sleep, and sometimes you just do. And I remember sleeping and waking up feeling refreshed, but also thinking, wow, we've got our car packed, we're about to get on the ferry to France, and I'm still sleeping in the afternoon. I don't know if I can do this. But I like adventure and I like a challenge. And so we set sail and we made it happen.
Yeah. And, this kind of like constant readjustment is such a challenge, isn't it? Because, I mean, almost overnight, you go from, Simon who's mountain biking at the weekend to Simon who's like lying on the floor in the dark, as you said. Um, but, even after that, there's these kind of changes. You find something that helps and you see a little bit of improvement, and then you push it too hard and you have a crash, and then you find a whole load more things, and it's like you level up and then you level up. And every time this happens, like it's great when you start to feel a little bit more better, but you've got to completely readjust everything. The sort of what can I do safely? What should I not be doing? What's my body telling me now? What does these signals mean now? Everything kind of changes. And it's such a challenge, isn't it, to sort of readjust your expectations. And then it must be really difficult for those around you as well to kind of understand that you're in a slightly different place, but you're not down there, but you're not up here yet. And like, was that something that you found sort of easier on the journey, once you'd left, or was it just another phase of readjustment?
I'd say it was another phase of readjustment because the symptoms that I had still remained. I had a lot of brain fog, so driving I still found quite challenging. I love music, but I wouldn't let anyone put the radio on in the car just yet because I just couldn't cope with that. Just being on a motorway driving through Europe was really just enough. I'm just working the hard edge, as they say, in terms of expanding my window of tolerance. And so, yeah, I was trying to keep conversation to a minimum. And yeah, really, and as you alluded to earlier, it's definitely another aspect of the illness, trying not to let it invade the lives of those around you too much and trying to mitigate that. I think for me, at least by this point, was 2018. So we're 5 years. I'm 5 years in, and I'm at a point where I know myself well. I know my limits. I still had the setbacks. They were always part of my weeks and months, but I could predict them. I could feel them coming on, and I knew when enough was enough. Going home early, going out to parties, making sure I was in bed, like Cinderella, being in bed by 8, 9 o'clock, so that I'm not transformed back into that bed-bound zombie that I had been previously. So the challenges remained, but just being somewhere different, somewhere bright, somewhere new, somewhere exciting. Again, that was another challenging part because I also had adrenal fatigue. And so I couldn't allow myself to get overexcited about anything, over enthusiastic. It sounds strange, but anyone who's had this will know that, yeah, I had to keep my equilibrium at all costs. And so even inside, I mentioned this in the book, inside I was doing cartwheels about lots of things, but I couldn't really express it because I just had to keep on an even keel emotionally and physically, and in terms of cognitive and physical output. But as time went on, as I progressed, as I recovered further, I was able to have a lot more fun.
Yeah, and that is something that we lose, isn't it? When everything does just, well, go to hell in a handbasket, you know, you lose any sense of fun, of enjoyment, of those sort of things that make life worth living. And it's so amazing when we start to get even those teeniest, tiniest little glimmers of half a smile, of something that makes you laugh. We really treasure those moments, don't we, when they come, because they sort of feel like they've been lost for quite a long time, I think. Um, so you talk about, I think you might have mentioned it in the context of sort of temperature, and you were obviously experiencing more sunshine where you were when you were sort of in Portugal, or certainly traveling towards Portugal, and that kind of normalizing the fluctuation of kind of energy and, well, mood and everything, I suppose, in life. When we have something like long COVID, ME/CFS, these sorts of illnesses, you have the peaks and the troughs are really, really big. And these sort of fluctuations where we can have one day where you do wake up feeling half normal, and then the next day you wake up feeling like, you're a corpse. And they're not normal fluctuations. But actually, as we start to feel a lot better and, move back towards, that sort of doing better, recovered phase, certainly for me, it was realizing that life is fluctuating. You do have a bad sleep one night. You do have a day where you just feel like you're in a bit of a mood. Things fluctuate, stressful things happen. Life will throw stuff at you. And like, how did you handle that kind of moving from a place of the big peaks and the troughs and the sort of like, trenches of illness into, it's okay that I'm feeling slightly more tired today, without, sort of normalizing tiredness? And I don't know, am I putting this in a way that makes sense? How did you experience that?
Absolutely. And that was a really large part of the final phase of my recovery, was to recalibrate how it feels to be tired. and what level of activity, be that cognitive or physical, should bring about that tiredness, and to what degree. And so I'd lost all memory of that, which sounds really odd, but I didn't know how I should feel after a long walk, or if I'd been out at a party or in a meeting, if I'd been talking to somebody without a break for an hour, how should I feel after that? Am I tired because it's still the ME? Am I tired because it's normal to be tired? I really had to relearn that. And quite often I would look to other people. If I saw people doing exercise, I would sort of look at their faces and see how tired they look, and try and find the recalibration for myself. And I would constantly ask my wife, because she's very active as well. She'd get home from a run, and I said, "What, are you tired? How tired are you? 1 to 10, how tired are you?" I just did not know, and I just had to really begin that process of relearning, and in so doing, it helped me separate what remained of my symptoms in terms of the fatigue and the brain fog and all the other things which would come as part of the post-exertional malaise, and what was genuine, what was to be expected, what was totally normal for a human body to feel after doing something.
Yeah. And I think it's particularly difficult, when you've been, you know, you get a cold, and most sensible people, when they get a cold, will reduce their activity for a few days, and then they're fine, and they resume activity, and all is well. Like, you don't kind of learn that new level of tiredness when you experience something like that. But with something that lasts longer, months, years, multiple years, you do completely lose that sense of what it feels like to be sort of quote unquote normal tired. But I think we also lose a lot of fitness. So one of the things that I found quite challenging when I was starting in that kind of upswing, where I was starting to do a bit more, was actually realizing that, walking to the post box, you know, nobody gets tired walking to the post box. But actually, if you have been in a position where you're really not moving at all for some time, you know, actually walking into the post box is like 20 times what you've been doing. So it's like somebody who can run a kilometer suddenly running 20 kilometers. And you would expect to be tired after that. So actually walking to the post box in that context is a massive increase. So yes, you would expect to be really tired. So it's kind of taking it and putting it into the context of my experience in that moment, rather than comparing myself to before, or a person who hadn't had this experience. So for me, it wasn't just what is normal tired for this activity, it's actually what is tired for me as I'm starting to move back into actually doing anything. And that added that extra kind of level of sort of complexity and difficulty. And obviously for other people watching you, very difficult for them to get it as well.
There's lots going on different levels, separating out, as you say, what remains of the illness-induced fatigue, what's the normal tiredness, and how do we separate the two?
Yeah, and I think we get it wrong, don't we, as well? And that has to be okay. I think one of the things I learned was that actually one of the best way to learn is to do. And in order to learn by doing, you are going to make mistakes. So that's got to be okay. Let go of that perfectionism.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember being in Portugal one particular week, and I was going to the gym quite often. I started going once a week, and then I upped it to twice a week, etc. And I found myself in a week where I'd been 3 times that week already. They were just for an hour, and I was taking the classes as easy as I possibly could. And I remember going on day 4, and I was just sitting with my head in my arms in the waiting area. Everyone else is sort of chatting and excited about the session and everything. And I just thought I should not be here 100%. And I was thinking, if I could just pull myself together, I was just trying to motivate myself. But it wasn't going to happen. I just went home. I knew that was the best thing to do. And I just knew instinctively that was the best thing to do. And that I pushed a little bit too hard that week. But that's all part of relearning where the limits are. And also, as you mentioned, moving forward with them and remembering that it's all part of the course in terms of recovery. And to be patient as well, be patient with yourself and with the process is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things we learn is to listen to our bodies. We were talking earlier about the sort of disconnection from bodies and, how we can just steamroller over them when the mind is in control. And, we really do learn to listen. And it sounds like you have learned that lesson, in that experience where you're like, no, my body doesn't need this today. I mean, you're in Portugal, go sit on a beach.
Yeah, I definitely did a lot of that, which really helps. That did help a lot. I should probably say some sort of medical disclaimer that I'm not claiming that's going to help everybody, but I did find it helped me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's everyone finds their own path,
Mm.
and that was your path.
Yeah.
And it sounds amazing, and it will work for some people, and it may not be the right way for others, I think. Um, so I think finally what I would love to ask you is, looking back from Simon now, what would you say to Simon at the start of his journey when his world has fallen apart and everything feels impossible? What do you think he would need to know?
I would say be open-minded about what may help you. Be as kind as you can towards yourself throughout this process. And I use the experience as an opportunity for growth. And that is something I did do. All those endless hours lying in a dark room, lying on the sofa. I like to think that I put them to fairly good use, that I worked through various things, past traumas. I got into therapy and worked through a lot of that stuff because I thought that it might help. And I think on some level it probably did. And to keep hope, just retain hope, whatever happens, however many setbacks you get, however many relapses, however hard it is to leave the party early, all of these things, just know that it's all incremental gains. That's really what you're working towards, incremental gains. And so if you have to make 1,000 compromises, then it's part of the process. Yeah, and knowing when to push forward and knowing when to ease off. And this comes with self-knowledge, and that takes practice, it takes work. But it's certainly what helped me recover. And so to be hopeful, to remain hopeful, and to know that it is possible to recover. Because that's something I didn't always know. I'd like to sit here and say I was entirely positive all the way through, but that's totally impossible. I wouldn't be human if that was the case. And I had a lot of dark days, and I really didn't know I was going to get better. I would reach a plateau, and I would think, well, this is it. This is as well as I'm going to get. I may as well get used to it, and sit here, and try and find the small joys and pleasures in life. And that was very important. And like you say, it can really bring you into touch with the small pleasures in life, which is a wonderful thing. But I also knew that I wanted to try and get to the next level. And if I did, I did. And if I didn't, I didn't. And it just became this sort of internal game of progress, really. And taking a chance sometimes when it was the right thing to do, and not taking chances on other days.
Well, Simon, thank you so much for being here today, for coming and chatting to me, for sharing so much of your journey and your story. And please go and read the book. It's a really good read. I'll make sure that all the links go into the show notes, and everything that you've sent me will go in there. So yeah, Simon, thank you so much. I'm delighted that that you're better, that you're back to life, and I think it's so inspiring for everybody to hear that. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Jackie. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.